Today I'm speaking with Dr. Mikel Burley, who is Associate Professor of Religion and Philosophy at the University of Leeds. And he spoke at the most recent seminar on the topic of immortality, and he gave a very interesting paper which discussed different ideas and conceptions around ideas of immortality and nirvana in different Buddhist traditions. And he's going to be talking about that with us today. So welcome.
Thank you.
So could you just introduce yourself and your research in this area?
Yes, sure. I mean, as you said, I'm Associate Professor of Religion and Philosophy at the University of Leeds. I work in the School of Philosophy, Religion and History of Science, and this gives me, I've got a lot of colleagues who work in philosophy and also in religious studies, and a couple of theologians and also historians of science. So it's a really good mixture that we've got at Leeds. And my own research ranges across philosophy of religion. That's the sort of broad area. And then I've also got some background expertise in South Asian religions, and that includes Hindu and Buddhist traditions. And my sort of broad research project is to try to incorporate a wider range of religious traditions into the study of philosophy of religion than has tended to be the case over past decades. And so, for example, a couple of recent research projects that I undertook resulted in books. One of which was called Rebirth and the Stream of Life, a philosophical study of reincarnation, karma, and ethics. That came out in 2016. And more recently than that, just in January this year, 2020, a book called A Radical Pluralist Philosophy of Religion, Cross-Cultural, Multi-Religious, Interdisciplinary. Both of these books had similar aim, which is, as I say, to sort of try and broaden out the field of research that goes on under the heading of philosophy of religion. So there's some of the things that I've been involved with.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds quite a wide range of interests that you have there. So in the paper you focused on Buddhist traditions. So could we begin by just, could you tell us a little bit about the diversity of Buddhist traditions that exist?
Yeah, I can say a little. I mean, Buddhist traditions are indeed very diverse. That's not unique among religions. Once one starts studying religion, one sees that what get called sort of isms, or say Christianity, for example, turns out to be very, very complex and diverse. In the case of Buddhism, well, it's got a sort of 2.5 millennia history and has spread very far. Both across Asian countries, but more recently, over recent centuries, across the world. And this has given it multiple opportunities to become extremely diverse, sort of incorporating, appropriating, absorbing different aspects of culture from different societies. I mean, from quite an early period, Buddhism, it seems, diverged into different lineages or different sort of sub-traditions, different branches. And over time, over the centuries, these sort of perhaps coagulated into 3 major branches. Other little schools and sub-branches sort of perhaps dropped away over time. And the 3 major branches also underwent little sort of divergences and further schools emerged. But those 3 major branches or traditions, as many listeners might know, are called Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And I won't say a great deal about them because some of this is quite general knowledge. But the Theravada tradition, sometimes referred to as the Southern tradition or Southern school, is most associated with countries such as Sri Lanka and Southeast Asian countries, including Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and it has various characteristics which I could go into, but let me just mention the other two. So there's the Mahayana tradition, which is extremely internally diverse. I mean, the Mahayana tradition originated in India a couple of thousand years ago, and it's largely that tended to spread to sort of Central and East Asian countries. So we find Mahayana represented within China and Korea and Japan and also Vietnam and some other countries as well. And the third, the Vajrayana tradition, is sometimes regarded as a sort of subcategory, a sub-branch of the Mahayana, and at other times as a sort of tradition in its own right. Vajrayana, literally the diamond or adamantine vehicle. It's particularly associated with Tibetan Buddhism, and Mongolia, and also Nepal, and other places where sort of forms of Tibetan style Buddhism are found. So Bhutan would be another place. And so those are some of the sort of geographical associations of these different traditions. And it might take a little long to go into the sort of the details, the ramifications, the different sort of doctrines and so on of each of them. But it's just an indication of how diverse Buddhism is. And so diverse is it that some recent textbooks on Buddhism have tried to use plural terms, rather than the singular Buddhism. So, for example, there's a textbook by John Strong called Buddhisms in the plural, and he's not the only one to use that plural term. And then an earlier textbook by three authors was called, interestingly, originally it was called The Buddhist Religion, and then in its fifth edition it changed the name. The title was changed to Buddhist Religions in the plural. So this is a definite trend, I think, in contemporary scholarship to emphasise the plurality and the diversity.
That's a really useful overview. And bearing in mind all this diversity within traditions, are there some key shared concepts, beliefs, practices that make up the Buddhist religions?
Yes, well, I mean, I suppose, to use a Wittgensteinian metaphor, one might think of it as a family, a sort of a set of family resemblances. So inevitably there's going to be overlap and similarities as well as differences between these traditions, and hence not easy to sharply demarcate them. And among the overlapping features, there are some that we find. I hesitate to say they're sort of definitive of what Buddhist teachings are, because one's likely to find exceptions to anything one says along those lines. But there are some extremely prevalent and common themes and central doctrines. So among the ones that I mentioned, just to illustrate the point in the talk I gave at the Inform seminar, were the Four Noble Truths, as they're still most commonly referred to, and as one of those, the Noble Eightfold Path, which is one of those four Noble Truths. And then I also referred to the doctrine of samsara and nirvana, and then that was a sort of lead into the topic that I was talking about, which was different interpretations of nirvana. I mean, would you like me just to outline the Four Noble Truths, for example? Is that worth doing? Yeah,
I think that would be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put it pretty concisely. I mean, one way of encapsulating the so-called Four Noble Truths is in terms of a medical analogy, which is actually, this analogy is present in Buddhist traditions themselves. So we might think of the first of these so-called truths as the diagnosis of our existential predicament, we might say. And what is that diagnosis? Well, the diagnosis is phrased in terms of the Pali term, or the Pali term dukkha, which has a Sanskrit equivalent as well, and equivalents in other languages. And dukkha is most commonly still translated as suffering, but it has a sort of a wide range of meanings, various forms of dissatisfaction or distress, and so on. And the claim is that there's some sense in which that quality pervades our life, even in our most enjoyable moments. There's a kind of residue of dissatisfaction that drives along, and can sometimes be accentuated and at other times diminish. So that's the sort of diagnosis, and then there's the second truth can be regarded as the etiology, or the claim about the cause of that pervasive predicament that we're in. And what is the cause? Well, on most accounts, that second noble truth is that the cause of the suffering, the cause of the dissatisfaction, is a kind of craving or thirst, to put it even more literally, thirsting for things to be other than they are. So in these many Buddhist traditions, the onus tends to be on us to sort of recognize that it's something in us that's driving our lives and our dissatisfaction as well. And that is a sort of a craving, a thirsting, a desiring for things to be other than we find them. The third truth can be sort of spelt out in terms of the prognosis, and this is where, so the first two noble truths sometimes get Buddhism characterized as a pessimistic view of life in the world, whereas the third is a bit more positive. It says that there is a way, there is a cessation. There's the possibility of a cessation of that state of dissatisfaction and suffering, or misery and distress. And that cessation is, one term for it is nirodha, but in essence it's nirvana. Nirvana is the cessation of suffering, dissatisfaction, and so on. And so that's the sort of goal. That's what's being aimed for. Mm. And then the fourth of the truths is referred to by a couple of terms. One is to call it the middle way. Sometimes it's just referred to as the path, and we could call it the remedy, to stick with the sort of medical analogy. So it's the way of achieving the goal, which was the third noble truth. And so this remedy is the noble eightfold path. So it comes with sort of 8 main spokes. It's sometimes depicted as an 8-spoked wheel, sort of figuratively, or as an image, a symbol. And I won't go through all 8 of them, but I'll just mention that these 8 components of the path are typically divided into 3 categories. So there's the category of wisdom, which comprises 2 components. Wisdom, well, it's often translated as wisdom, or panna would be the Pali term. And then there's the second category, comprises 3 components, and that's known as sila, or morality, so different moral injunctions, different aspects of how one should live one's life. And the third category is samadhi, which in this context is normally translated as meditation. And that comprises 3 components, including mindfulness and also a sort of concentrative form of meditation. And that third category is traditionally limited or applies primarily to the monastic practitioners, so especially Buddhist monks, and not so much to the lay people at all. In fact, only to a minority of monastics. But as many people probably realise, these days in contemporary Buddhism, especially in Western countries, but not only in Western countries, the Buddhist dimension has become extremely popular and common. And there's a lot of Buddhist meditation classes and courses, and mindfulness and all of that. And this is one way in which Buddhism has become increasingly popular outside of its traditional Asian sort of homelands. Oh, and then there was the samsara and nirvana. I'll just at least introduce what those terms are, and then we can talk a bit more about nirvana specifically. So samsara literally translates as flowing or flowing on, in the way that a river or a stream might flow on. But the more common translation is cycle of rebirth. and that's what that's sort of what it typically refers to. It's the flowing on from one life to another, which sometimes gets referred to as reincarnation. Within Buddhist contexts, the term when we're talking in English, then rebirth is a common term to use. And so it's thought that we don't have just one lifetime, but there's some sense in which we have multiple lifetimes, and we've had multiple lifetimes in the past, and that these are conditioned by the kinds of morally relevant actions that we've performed, and hence you've got the sort of doctrine of karma built into this idea. And so there's also a way of characterizing the Buddhist goal that I mentioned before as nirvana, as seeking the cessation of this very cycle of rebirths, so bringing an end to samsara. Not all Buddhist traditions would characterize it in those terms, but that's quite a common way of thinking about it. And which brings us to nirvana, or back to nirvana. And what is this term? Well, we've got a lot more to say about this, but as a starting point, we can think of it as, one sort of fairly literal translation of the term nirvana, or its Pali equivalent nibbana, would be blowing out or going out, as in the snuffing out or extinguishing of a flame, especially sort of a candle flame. And so nirvana is, in a literal sense, the going out of a flame. But then there's all sorts of questions about, well, what's the flame, and what does that amount to? Which it remains an open question and a contested question, and that's why I thought it might be interesting to explore some competing interpretations or conceptions of nirvana, and also how the notion of nirvana links to the concept of immortality.
Yeah. So that would be great if we could talk in a bit more depth about these different understandings of nirvana. And I think in the paper you used a fourfold typology that was developed by Becker. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
If you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yes, that's right. I borrowed this fourfold typology from a chapter in a book by Carl Becker. His book is called, actually I've got it on my desk here, it's Breaking the Circle, Death and the Afterlife in Buddhism, published back in 1993, still a good and interesting book. And he presents, he's now at the University of Kyoto. He's done a lot of work in Buddhist studies and also comparative religions, and he's written a lot of interesting work on especially on sort of conceptions of death and dying and the afterlife and such topics. And this fourfold typology that he puts forward is quite convenient. There's different ways of dividing up the different views and interpretations, but this one's quite interesting. So the four are, to sort of list them, there's nirvana conceived of as annihilation. That would be the first. That's the first one. Then there's nirvana as eternal life, as he puts it. And I think what he has in mind with the term eternal life there is what we might call it endless life, rather than eternal in the sense of outside time or atemporal or timeless. It's the sense of eternal as going on and on forever. And the third is nirvana conceived of as an ethical state in this world, as opposed to in some other life or other world. And the fourth is nirvana as a transcendent state. Becker also refers to it as an ineffable state, and the way he sort of describes it is nirvana as a state in which there's no longer any individual existence, but one has merged into some greater whole. So that's the sense of the fourth of these four. And yeah, I can say a good deal more about each of them.
Well, can you say something about the relationship between the four of them? Are they mutually exclusive, or can people hold a combination of them at one time?
Whether a lot depends on the details. So this is a fourfold typology, and it's a kind of rough and ready starting point, because one could fill out these basic ideas in many different ways, and how one fills them out will have a bearing on the extent to which they're compatible or overlapping or exclusive. So yeah, I think they interrelate in some very interesting ways. So I'll give some examples. So the idea of nirvana as annihilation, this would be that that when one achieves nirvana, one's not merely bringing a sort of end to, or a cessation to the craving and desire and desireful aspects of our nature, which drive the cycle of rebirth, but it's actually an extinction of, it's a snuffing out of life and consciousness itself. So this idea of annihilation is the idea of a radical cessation of samsara. There's no longer any individual to persist, and this could be thought of as a broad category that would encompass, say, an interpretation such as that of an ethical state in this world, as Becker puts it. And Becker himself thinks that the ethical state interpretation is just kind of dissolves into a version of annihilationism, the annihilation interpretation. And we can see why that might be, because if the emphasis is on nirvana as an ethical state, it's an injunction to live your life in a certain way, but it's not making any claim about continuation beyond this life. It's sort of implying, at least, that one's life does come to a complete end when one has achieved one has lived one's life in the optimal ethical way, as it were, as the Buddha would be an exemplar of. Then we can see why somebody might think that it's just a version of the annihilation interpretation. But I want to question that. One of the things I do very briefly, admittedly, in the version that I presented at the Inform seminar due to time constraints, but in a fuller version of the paper, I go to greater length. But they're just not trying to defend any particular interpretation, but just showing how this ethical state interpretation can make a lot more sense than some people might at first think it does. So taking Becker as my example of a sort of critic of it, he thinks that it's almost sort of changing the question. It's changing the question from does the person who's achieved nirvana continue to exist beyond death or not? It's replacing that question with a question about what values one ought to live by in one's life. What sort of ethical life should one live? Now, neither he nor anyone else would deny that these are closely related questions, but nevertheless, some would want to say that they're distinct questions. How should one live on the one hand, and do we continue to exist after death, having achieved nirvana on the other? I want to say, well, yes, in a way, they're different questions, but one can see how the ethical state interpretation need not be a reductive one, because to treat it as reductive in the sense of just claiming that we go out of existence and that's it, would be to miss the point that especially within Buddhist teachings, how one lives one's life is an absolutely central issue, and to live one's life in such a way that one sort of frees oneself from certain impurities, as it might be put, certain psychological impurities, emotional impurities, and so on. To live one's life in a way that frees one from those is to transform one's life in a very existential, ontological, to use a sort of philosophical term, way, and and that sort of blurs the boundary, I think, between these questions of existence and questions of ethics.
Mm. So could we turn now to the idea of nirvana as endless life, did you call it? Could you tell us a bit more about that? What would that look like in Buddhist tradition?
Yeah, I mean, this interpretation of nirvana gets a lot of its strength, its force, from the fact that in a large number of Buddhist texts, there are various synonyms for nirvana. You know, it's not always referred to as nirvana. And one of the prominent synonyms is amata. That's the Pali term, and amrita is the Sanskrit equivalent. And these terms literally can be translated as not dying, or undying, or the deathless is another term that's often used. And so we find this term amata early on in a sermon attributed to the Buddha that's traditionally regarded as the first sermon that he delivered after achieving enlightenment or nirvana or spiritual awakening himself. And it was a sermon allegedly delivered to 5 monks in the deer park near Varanasi in northern India. And at least in one version, or a couple of versions of this sermon, he sort of announces that he has discovered the deathless amata, this state. And it's clear from the context that he's using it as a synonym for nirvana, and it's used elsewhere as a synonym for nirvana, either as a synonym or as a sort of adjective, or as a term that's characterizing nirvana. So this idea of the deathless or the undying or not dying is very intimately bound up with the notion of nirvana. And just to go a little bit more into the etymology of amata, it's cognate with the Latin immortalis, and that's the term from which English derives its word immortality. So one will indeed read translations of Buddhist texts translated into English where amata and amrita are translated as immortality. So it's a legitimate translation because of the close sort of etymological connections, but it doesn't resolve the issue, of what it means, because there's a whole cluster of questions about how we have to interpret the term immortality or immortal. But it's there, it's there embedded right, front and center in some of the Buddhist texts. This notion of immortality, the deathless, as a characterization of nirvana, and so we can see how it's extremely tempting to think of nirvana as a in the sense of endless life, just ongoing, without end. And so yeah, that's where that notion of nirvana as endless life, one of the places at least where it gets its strength.
Fascinating. Are there limitations though of applying kind of a Western idea of immortality onto these traditions and concepts?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I think in a sense, I don't want to sound vague, but in a sense, yes. In a sense, no. In a sense, no, because as I suggested just now, the concept of immortality itself is sort of interpretable in many different ways. And if we think about, Sanskrit and Pali are sort of Indo-European languages. They're not that, they've got connections with say ancient Greek and Latin, and through that through those channels with modern European languages. And so it's not necessarily misleading to look for, say, conceptual connections between some of the terminology that we have available to us in the English language, for example. But of course, we need to be cautious with it and not import into our interpretation of the Buddhist sources, assumptions, presuppositions, concepts and ideas that are derived from other contexts, and assume that they're present within the Buddhist material. So I don't think there's any necessary harm in thinking about this sort of range of terms that I've been using already, like the deathless or undying or immortality or the immortal and so on, as a starting point for trying to interpret what's going on within the Pali or the Sanskrit texts. Provided we're open to the possibility of interpreting those terms in multiple ways. So that's where the danger is. If one were, for example, to have some specific interpretation of what immortality means in Christianity, for example, and to then inject that into the Buddhist sources, that would be extremely misleading. But not so misleading if one recognises that even within Christianity there are multiple different ways of interpreting what immortality might mean, or eternal life, and so on, and to be cautiously constructive and imaginative in drawing comparisons across different, whether it be philosophical or religious traditions, in order to enrich the sort of range of different possibilities of interpretation.
Yeah. And then you touched on this briefly, but in the paper you gave, you spoke about this idea of moving from ontology towards axiology. Could you explain that to our listeners, please?
Yeah, this brings us back to Carl Becker, actually, because I derived that phrase or that notion of a move from ontology to axiology from Becker, and it occurs actually in part of his sort of critique or objection that he's raising to the ethical state interpretation. So ontology, I used this term earlier in our conversation, actually, didn't I? Ontology to do with being and what exists. One could think of ontology as the study of what exists. That would be one way of thinking of it. And axiology as to do with value and what has value. And so we could think of it as the study of value and what has value. And by talking in terms of a shift or a move from ontology to axiology, what Becker was suggesting is that the ethical state interpretation of nirvana changes the subject. It actually, I alluded to this before, didn't I? That it sort of shifts it replaces one question, the question of is there a continuation of existence or life beyond death for the one who has attained nirvana. It replaces that question with the question of how one ought to live and the values one ought to live by. And Becker thinks that this is a reductive move. It's no longer dealing with the question that we were originally interested in. But my approach is to want to, I suppose, interrogate or question the distinction that's being made there, because here's a I think an important and central notion or concept, which interestingly is one that occurs both within Buddhist traditions and in Christian traditions. It's the notion of dying to the self, in the sense of sort of relinquishing, renouncing certain desires that one and psychological impulses that might drive one in an unproductive sort of direction. And it's going to have different resonances within different Buddhist traditions, and in comparison with different Christian traditions as well. But there are some affinities. There are some affinities at least. And it's the central idea, dying to the self, the idea of dying to the centrality, the importance, the significance of oneself as a concrete individual, and seeing more of a an ethical significance in one's compassionate relationship to others, or within Buddhist traditions we might use the term loving kindness or compassion. And I can make a connection here with the fourth of the interpretations that I haven't yet said much about. The fourth of the interpretations in the typology, and that's this idea of a transcendent state. Now, Becker is very favourable to this interpretation, and there are good reasons why one might be. It's the idea that nirvana is doesn't involve a continuation of oneself as a distinct individual, but it involves a sort of a merging of one's individuality into some greater whole. And we find some sort of metaphors or analogies along these lines in some traditional Buddhist sources. So there's one that's sometimes cited from the Milinda Panna, which is a dialogue between a king and a Buddhist monk named Nagasena. And at one point, the king asks Nagasena about the Buddha. He says, "Does the Buddha still exist? Is the Buddha still? Is the Buddha still alive, or does the Buddha still exist?" And Nagasena says, "Yes, he does still exist, even though this is after the time when the Buddha's sort of physical body is no longer around." And so the king says, "Well, can you point to him? Is he here? Is he there? Where is he?" And Nagasena uses the analogy of a flame that is part of a larger fire, and he says, if you consider a flame that is then, the way he puts it sounds like he puts it in terms of disappearing, but I think what he means is sort of being reabsorbed into the main body of the fire. Can you point to the flame? Can you say that the flame is here or there? Does it exist or does it not exist? And what Nagasena is implying is that there's a sense in which it still exists, but not as an individual. And a similar kind of analogy, a watery analogy rather than a fiery analogy, is that of a drop sort of dissolving into the ocean, or it's being absorbed into the ocean, that kind of thing. So we find these sorts of analogies, and as I say, Becker himself and others are quite favourable to this. And one of the things I say in my paper is that that itself can be read in ethical terms. The idea of ceasing to privilege oneself as a concrete individual, and seeing more of a sort of equivalence of value across one's own life and that of others, and extending that compassionate range, that compassionate reach out to all sentient beings, or all living beings, as some Buddhist traditions would put it, is a kind of, it's not stretching the point too far to say that is a kind of merging into a greater whole. It's a merging into a greater whole in a very profoundly ethical sense. And I want to say that there's no sharp distinction between the ontological and the ethical here, because by extending one's sphere of care and concern and compassion in that way, one is reinterpreting and differently understanding one's own being in quite a deep ontological sense. So yeah, that's the way I sort of come back at and provide a little bit of counter criticism to the idea that the ethical state view is a merely reductive view.
That's great. That's really fascinating stuff, and perhaps very relevant for people going forward in the post-COVID world. The idea of loving kindness and compassion for others and so on. So just to end, have you got any research projects lined up for the future? Right, yeah, there's a few things I'm working on. There's possibly a risk of me spreading myself a little too thinly, because I'm interested in so many different traditions and areas of in the philosophy of religion.
So, I mean, one project that's at quite an early stage is actually to do with African religions, and it's especially to do with Yoruba traditional religion in West Africa. And so I had an article published in the journal Religious Studies very recently on Yoruba mythology. And I want to follow this up. I'm very interested, for example, in works of literature, including plays and also novels that are coming out of a traditional sort of Yoruba context, and what those can tell us about the idea of inhabiting a world of spiritual beings within that particular traditional sort of African religious context. So that's one project that's at quite an early stage and is ongoing, and it's connected with a further sort of quite broad-ranging project that I've got, which is to draw increasingly extensively upon works of literature, especially narrative literature, but also poetry and dramatic literature, so plays, as resources for the philosophy of religion, to as a resource, as a way of broadening out the scope of finding ways of engaging with religious traditions, religious ideas that have tended to be somewhat neglected within standard modes of philosophy of religion. So I'll give just one example of an article that I'm hoping will come out in a journal before very long. It was a comparison of ideas from two poets from very different cultural contexts. So I was looking at work by R.S. Thomas, the Welsh poet, who was an Anglican minister in the 20th century, and comparing some. Well, it was sort of comparative, but it was at least drawing upon both these poets. The other poet was Ram Prasad Sen, who is a Bengali poet from the 18th century, and his poems are directed towards, or they're about, the goddess, the Hindu goddess Shakti or Kali, that goes by various names. And the common theme there was that both these poets express a kind of troubled sense of the suffering and evil and misery in the world, and how to reconcile that with the idea of a sort of all-powerful deity. So that the old problem of evil, as philosophers of religion and theologians would call it. But I thought it would be very interesting to see how sort of religiously committed poets were grappling with those ideas within very different cultural contexts, and so that's one little fruit of this turn. What we could call it a turn to narrative, or a turn to literature in the philosophy of religion that I'm trying to look at.
Right, that sounds fascinating. We look forward to seeing those future works. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, you're very welcome, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
Great.